بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم من الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. This is the ayah that we've discussed over and over again, and we've been commenting on this throughout the past 4 or 5 days. Before I actually begin, I want to make a couple comments. First of all, yesterday, I just want to clarify one thing. When we talked about the sunan of wudu, actually how to perform the wudu from beginning to end, I mentioned that part of it is first you wash your hands, then you rinse your mouth to the back of the throat, and then you wash to the back of your nose 3 times. All of that is established by the sunnah. After I mentioned those steps, I said, and one of the neat things about these 3 steps is that they allow you to check the water. That's not why they're there. That's just an extra way to think about it. But those acts are all established by the sunnah. There are clear hadith establishing those acts. So I want to make sure that people understand how those acts are established within our sharia. It so happens that if you reflect on those acts, you see that they tie in with water beautifully, but that's just a secondary thing. The reason why we do it is because we're following the footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ. He did it, and so we do it. What I want to discuss today is something that isn't specifically part of the wudu, but it comes under the discussion of wudu, and it's actually a very, very important discussion because it affects many of us in the way we perform our wudu, and that is wiping over leather socks. It's unique or interesting that when you look at books of fiqh, the book of wiping over leather socks is always separate from the actual wudu itself. It's always separate. So they'll discuss the wudu and they'll discuss many aspects of wudu, and then there'll always be a separate chapter, or often there'll be a separate chapter which discusses the wiping over leather socks. And the reason is because if you really think about it and reflect on wiping over leather socks for a moment, it seems contrary to the entire act of wudu in this way. See, the Quran tells you to do 4 things. The Quran tells you, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ, wash your faces, وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ, and wash your hands to your including your elbows, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, and wipe your heads, وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ, and wash your feet, including your ankles. So now here is the Holy Quran commanding you that you have to wash your feet. You're being commanded to wash your feet, so how can you wipe over them? How can you wipe over socks? How can the Quran tell you you have to wash your feet, and it's commanding you to wash your feet, and then you go ahead and wipe over your socks? How can you break an ayah of the Quran? So that should be the question that popped up in your mind, and actually that's one of the reasons why this is a separate discussion. Because initially, actually, Imam Abu Hanifa said you cannot wipe, like when Imam Abu Hanifa was originally developing his fiqh, he said it is not permissible to wipe over your leather socks. I will not permit it because the ayah of the Holy Quran has, as we discussed on several occasions, tawatur. The ayah of the Holy Quran was repeated in front of so many different Sahaba on so many different occasions and recited at so many different times that hundreds of Sahaba transmitted that ayah, that you have to wash your feet. And Imam Abu Hanifa said at that point he had only received a few reports of wiping over leather socks. So he said, and I only have a few reports here and there of people wiping over leather socks, so therefore I cannot equal those 2 things. The Quran is still the first source. And so the Quran says wash your feet, so you have to wash your feet. That was the original thinking of Imam Abu Hanifa. Then what happened was more and more reports began to reach Imam Abu Hanifa of so many Sahaba wiping their feet that it became at the level of tawatur. The idea of wiping over socks, the idea of wiping over leather socks reached the level of tawatur. And so based on that, when so many ahadith about wiping over leather socks came from so many different companions, that then it reached the level of tawatur. It reached the level of 100% certainty and proof such that there was no doubt that had occurred. Then because hadith is also wahi, just like Quran, it is then permissible to wipe over leather socks. And in fact, Imam Abu Hanifa said, in his own words, مَا قُلْتُ بِالْمَسْحِ, I did not permit masha over the leather socks, حَتَّى جَاءَنِي, until it came to me, مِثْلَ النِّهَارِ, until it came to me like the light of day. Meaning until I had so many narrations from so many different companions that they were all wiping over leather socks, then and only then did I permit it because then at that point it reaches tawatur. And once it reaches tawatur, then Quran equals hadith. The big difference between Quran and hadith is that the Quran has all tawatur. Every ayah of the Quran has tawatur, whereas the majority of hadith don't have tawatur. So you can have a sahih hadith and it might be correct, but it still doesn't reach the level of so many Sahaba saying it and so many Sahaba transmitting it and it being very, very common knowledge among everybody. That's why Imam Abu Hanifa said this. And in fact, if you look at it, over 80 companions actually narrate that about wiping over leather socks. And of those 80, 10 of them are from Ashara Mubashara, the 10 who were promised Jannah. This is something that has come from so many different chains of transmission, and so many people have narrated it, and it was done on so many different occasions that therefore it is permissible to wipe over leather socks. Now, given that background, wiping over leather socks will be exactly that. It is only permitted in the case of leather socks, because the Quran is saying you have to wash. And the way you're getting around it is with leather socks from all these different narrators. You have so many narrations about leather socks. So therefore, you can only wipe if you're wearing leather socks. In fact, there are 3 conditions that you have to match. Either the sock has to be leather, and it has to cover the ankle. Now when we say leather socks, what we're talking about is a sock made of leather which subsequently covers the ankle. It rises up and covers the ankle. That's what we mean by leather sock, and most of you have seen it. But if it's not a leather sock, then it has to match the characteristics of a leather sock. Number 1, it has to be water resistant. Number 2, it has to stand on its own. And number 3, it has to be permissible to walk a good distance in that sock without it tearing. And many ulama say 1 mile, 2 mile, and it would be on sand, not on concrete. These 3 conditions have to be found in a sock before you can wipe over it. Number 1, it has to be thick enough that it stands on its own. It has to have its own form. Is Amjad here? Or is he actually left? Okay, because he has a very, very nice example of a sock like that. It's here. Let me see the sock. He was waiting for his moment to show us this. We've been dunking it under the sink regularly to test it and everything. For example, this is an excellent example. Now, I don't work for this company or anything. I know Amjad wants to set up a website to sell these things, but this is a sealskin sock. Okay, now one of the big things people have against leather socks is they say, you can't wear those, they're so bulky, and you can't wear any shoes on top of it properly, and it's very difficult to wear. So actually this is another type of sock, which kind of looks like a dress sock. So this is called a sealskin sock. So now look at it. Does it have its own form? You're never going to see this. This is picture perfect. When I saw this, then my eyes opened up and I said, oh, now I know what the ulama meant by having its own form when it stands on its own. This is the first time I saw that. Number 1, this has its own form. See? It's got its own shape. Even though it's a different kind of fabric. It's a very, very thick fabric. Number 2, it's waterproof. We put it under the sink and we just squeezed it until we couldn't feel anything. And in fact, when I was studying in Syria with someone named Shaykh Muhammad Yaqubi, many of you probably heard his name, he used to say to me, you have to be able to put your whole foot in water and you shouldn't feel it. You should be able to dump your foot in a bucket when you're wearing a sock that should match the characteristics of leather. So this actually does that. We tried it. And number 3, it's thick enough that if you walked on it, it's very thick. It's very thick here on the bottom. If you walked on it, it wouldn't tear. But anyway, I mean, you're not going to see this picture ever again. This is beautiful. This is. I mean, I read this so many times, but it didn't hit me the way when he put this up and showed this to me. I said, "Wow, this is. You should put these. Like they don't have illustrations in fiqh books, but you should put this one illustration in the fiqh book." So this is actually a very nice example of what we mean by that. That's very important because nowadays people. They wipe over cotton socks, and you have an ayah of the Quran telling you have to wash your feet. So if you're going to get around that ayah, you better bring a proof that equals the ayah. And the only way we have a proof that equals the ayah is in the case of leather socks. Now, I want to complete the discussion completely. So let me say a couple more things about cotton socks. Number 1, all 4 madhabs say you cannot wipe over cotton socks. All 4 madhabs. Imam Abu Hanifa's madhab, Imam Shafi'i's madhab, Imam Malik's madhab, and Imam Ahmad's madhab all agree that you cannot wipe over fabric socks that don't meet the characteristics of leather. So that's the first. Number 2, I realize that becomes a problem for people because when you're at work, you don't feel like sticking your foot in the sink, and especially if somebody walks in. It seems kind of weird. So there are ways around it. For example, perhaps one of the ways that I suggest to people is, these sealskin socks are really nice because they actually meet the characteristics and you can wipe over them. But the other way around it is, look, I've taught you the farad of washing the feet. And the very, very minimum thing that you have to do is you have to wet the foot one time. That's all Allah is asking from you. وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ And wash your foot to the ankle one time. Now the definition of washing within the Sharia is, the Sharia defines washing as wetting an entire body part such that 2 drops of water fall from it. That's the minimum definition of washing. So now I've given you the minimum times you have to do it and the minimum that you have to water that you have to put on the foot. So one way to do it is go ahead and make the whole wudu, and at the very end of the wudu, go into the stall. You know, the stall like into the washroom. Just go away from the sink, go into the stall, take your sock off, and just wet a paper towel, squeeze it over your foot, wet the whole foot, and make sure a few decent drops drop off your foot, and your foot will be washed. Just wash it once. You don't need to wash it 3 times if it's a difficult issue. But there's ways around it if you're careful and you realize that what the matter's about, because it's a big deal. Come on, I mean your salah is everything, and the wudu is the building up for the basis for the salah. So why screw around with the wudu? The wudu is like one of the most important. There's so many other things you can mess around with. It's not a big deal. But wudu is so important, and one of the important acts that Allah Himself listed in the Holy Book. So we should be very, very careful about how we deal with this matter. For the sake of completeness, let me just complete the whole argument. There are 3 hadith in the entire collection of all hadith. There are only 3 hadith which mention wiping over something which is called a jawrab. And a jawrab is very similar to what we might consider a fabric sock. There are only 3 hadith. Of those 3 hadith, one of them is narrated by Bilal, radiyallahu anhu, and it comes in a book called Mu'jam Saghir Tabrani. Mu'jam al-Saghir of Tabrani. That's one. Number 2 is narrated by Abu Musa, and it comes in Ibn Majah and Bayhaqi. And number 3 is narrated by Mughira ibn Shu'bah, and it comes in Tirmidhi. So there are 3 hadith which talk about wiping over the jawrab. The first 2 are by consensus weak. The first 2, by the consensus of the ulama, are weak. So put those away. So we're left with 1 hadith. That one single hadith, the third one, some ulama say it's weak, some ulama say it's not weak. So it's debating. So when you look at the whole issue, this one potentially weak hadith, and the 2 definitely weak hadith, do not have the strength to overturn the certain Quran. The Quran is certain. That ayah of the Quran is 100% certain. And these 3 hadith, 2 of which are definitely weak, 1 of which is possibly weak, does not have the power to reverse an ayah of the Quran and allow you allow exemption from washing the feet. Now, weak hadith are permissible to act upon, but they're not. But only in fada'il, in extra things, in extra credit, not to overturn an ayah of the Quran which is 100% certain. The only reason we permit wiping over leather socks is because there are enough ahadith that it equals the weight of the Quran in strength as a proof. And so therefore we say it's permissible to wipe over leather socks, but for the case of wiping over fabric socks, only 2 weak hadith and 1 potentially weak hadith exist, and those hadith do not have the strength to overturn a 100% certain ayah. It's 100% certain that you have to wash your feet. Now that's the complete discussion. Now you've heard all the various aspects of it. We should be very, very careful when we make our wudu that we wash our feet. I mean, I know it's difficult, but believe me, if you work hard, if you realize you can't wipe over your cotton sock, you'll come up with some way to get around it. MashaAllah, all of us are, we have minds, we manage to do things that we need to get done. And so inshallah, I'm confident that you can even do it in this. This is the basis of our salah, and our salah is the basis of everything. I mean, without salah, we're the most lost people in the world. I don't know what else would be the purpose of my life. Maybe somebody else has another purpose in their life, but salah is everything to me. And I'm sure it's for all of you as well, otherwise you wouldn't be here. The reason why I'm presenting this whole issue in so much detail is technically I should have been able to say to you, Imam Abu Hanifa says you can't do it, and everybody should have been content, to tell you the truth. Because we're not scholars. We're not scholars of fiqh. But the reason why I gave you a detailed discussion in this particular instance is because I want you to know that these people were not randomly making up their own opinions. They had reasons. Now, I mean, it's so beautiful when you think about how Imam Abu Hanifa is looking at all the nas, all of the Quran and Hadith, and how he's balancing the different laws. It's very, very beautiful the way that these people came up with these laws. So remember, we are Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. We are people of the Sunnah and we follow the Jama'ah. And the Jama'ah of the ulama has agreed that you cannot wipe over cotton socks. So once that's done, I throw my hands up and surrender. There's nothing more. I don't need to argue with anybody. I mean, the fact that I told you Imam Abu Hanifa, or the Hanafi madhab, which is not only Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, and the hundreds of thousands of other scholars that came after them and verified their work, once you know that, then it's over. What more do you need? But I gave you the proofs in this particular instance because it's such a common issue, and also because I want you to see how they derive these laws. You know, most people don't talk about this tawatur and all these concepts, but I think you have enough understanding that you can understand what these concepts are, and maybe you won't be able to derive law, but you'll be able to appreciate why we do follow law the way that we follow it. So it's very, very beautifully done. And you can imagine, I mean, if you're just picking up a hadith and reading it in Bukhari, you have no idea what are the other hadith on this subject, what other ayat of the Quran apply here. Does this hadith have tawatur or does it not have tawatur? So there's so many issues, and believe me, I've made this discussion so simple. We could have had a 3-hour discussion just on this issue, and we could have complicated it with so many other ideas within how you derive law. But I've tried to present it in a simple way so that you see that there's a beauty to the way in which law is derived.